This recording is brought to you by the Berkeley Fiction Review.
Hey everyone, welcome to Berkeley Fiction Review's podcast. We're your hosts. My name is Sofia and I'm the lead editor of the Berkeley Fiction Review podcast.
And I'm Alexander Flores, a deputy editor of the BFR podcast. And today we are delighted to welcome our guest, Melanie Abrams, who is a distinguished author and creative writing professor at UC Berkeley. Melanie is the author of 3 books exploring diverse themes from childhood to the joys of cannabis use, and her essays have also been published in reputable journals such as the Literary Hub. Beyond her writing, Abrams' creativity also extends into the realm of photography, where she pictures authors, children, and adults. Please welcome Professor Abrams.
Hi, I'm glad to be here.
We're so glad to have you on the podcast today, and you are the first official BFR podcast guest, which is super exciting. It's unbelievably bizarre that we have the author of The Joy of Cannabis a day before 420.
That's true. Perfect timing.
Yeah. So we wanted to start out with talking about Professor Abrams' career and her background. So where are you from, Professor Abrams?
I'm from Los Angeles, but more specifically from the Valley, which you may know from Valley Girl lore. Yeah, grew up in LA, and that's, where I'm from.
Cool. And where and when did you go to college?
I went to undergrad at UC Irvine, and then I went to grad school in North Carolina, University of North Carolina at Greensboro.
Cool. What did you study in university? Like, what degrees were you going for?
Yeah, undergrad, I have a degree in theater and English.
Interesting.
So I went into undergrad thinking that I wanted to be an actress. And then that got kind of shifted slightly to playwriting, and then pretty quickly to just creative writing in general. And then in grad school, I have a MFA from UNC Greensboro in fiction.
Cool. And we're an undergraduate publication, so what was your undergraduate experience like? Is there anything that stood out that you want to talk about?
I'll start with the undergraduate publication part of it, because my first published story was in the UC Irvine Literary Journal, which was called Fault Line. And that was pretty exciting. And then I actually, like you guys, it worked a little differently then, but I was the fiction editor of Fault Line, the undergrad fiction editor of Fault Line for a year. They had one graduate editor and one undergraduate editor. But I had a great university experience. I was super into taking advantage of all my opportunities. Went abroad, did playwriting, produced plays. Also lived on the beach and was just like a normal college student. So we got to do that down in Irvine.
Yeah, already seeing so many parallels. Wow. When did you know you wanted to become a professor?
That's a good one. I thought you were going to say, when did you know you wanted to become a writer, which I can also answer.
You can answer both.
Okay, so the writer part of it was actually in undergrad. I wasn't one of those kids that was where I had a pencil and a notebook in my hand all the time. I definitely thought I was going to totally go into theater. I grew up in LA surrounded by the movie business, and so I thought that was what I was going to do. And then I took basically I don't know what a Cal it is, but when you don't have to take the intro English class because you test out, you did AP or whatever, but you have to take the second one. Mm-hmm. And I did that one, and it was taught by a writer because UC Irvine has a really great grad school, and so they would get their grad students in fiction to teach these classes, and she obviously taught us composition and stuff, but she had especially was fiction, so we did a lot of fiction stuff. And basically as soon as I did the first fiction exercise in that class, I was basically felt like I was hit over the head with a baseball bat. I was oh, clearly I could do nothing else besides this from now on. So that was that. How I knew I wanted to be a professor, it's actually kind of a similar experience. I went to grad school, obviously, to be a writer, wanted to be a writer, et cetera, et cetera. Didn't know exactly what I was going to do when I graduated, but I got hired to teach, be a TA, kind of. And one of the requirements for that was having to not only interact with students and grade papers, but teach a class. And I was convinced that I wouldn't like it. I would just, kind of get through it. And I loved it. It was super fun to... it kind of blends a little bit of the performative piece of standing up in front of people, and also the, ideas of talking about writing and talking about literature, which I love. So it was a good kind of balance of both.
Amazing. That's such a great story. It's so interesting how, you combined your love of theater and writing in that. Do you remember, was there a specific subject of that first class that you taught?
Yeah, it was actually Shakespeare, which, I would never think of teaching now, but... it kind of, I'd never done that thing where you elicit ideas from students, and it is a little bit like play. You're like, this person says this and someone else has another idea and you add on to that. So yeah, it was super fun.
That's so cool. And do you remember, does a story that you wrote for like a fiction class early on really stand out? Is one of them that really like made you feel like you got hit in the head with that all that?
Yeah. That I wrote particularly. I mean, so I always talk about, I think there's kind of two kinds of writers when they first start out. And they're the writers that think everything they write is amazing, and then the writers that think everything they write is horrible. And I was definitely the writer who thought everything they wrote was amazing, which is like in theory good because it gives you a lot of like, confidence to like keep doing the thing and bringing the stuff in. It's also not great because then you go to grad school and you're like, whoa, I'm just like a little, fish, and there's a lot of other writers out here who are also the big fish in their little ponds, and now we're all little fish. But I absolutely remember, I talk about this in class sometimes about a story. I wrote this story and I wrote it, I hated it. I thought it was horrible. This is the antithesis of what I just told you. So like, I wrote this one story, I was like so disappointed with myself, so upset with myself, unhappy with it, and I actually I turned it in for a workshop, and I made an appointment with a professor to talk to him before a workshop. And also this was a visiting professor. It was Stuart Dybeck, who is like an incredible short story writer. If you're ever interested, he wrote a story called, lots of stories, but the one that I love is called We Didn't. And I highly recommend it. But I made an appointment with him because I was so embarrassed, and I like basically sat down in the chair. The first thing he said was, I want to let you know that I critique the story like I would critique a grad student because it was such an excellent story. And I was like, oh. And so the lesson there was like, never go to explain your work because you have no idea how it's going to hit. Like it might really resonate with someone, and you're just a bad reader of your own work. So I remember about that particular story.
That's definitely a really relatable experience. I mean, every week in our class sessions, we review 3 short stories, or 2 to 3. And actually last night we had our student story week, which is when students from the class itself submit their stories, and we kind of anonymously talk about them as a class. So yeah, it's interesting to see how everything resonates differently with everyone. Yeah. And I imagine it must be really nerve-wracking to be those students, but we always get some really talented, amazing writers. So yeah, it's always a really interesting part of our class. Back to your professor career, what inspired you to pursue a career at UC Berkeley? Like what led you to Berkeley?
Yeah, such a good question. And if you talk to anyone in academia, you'll know that it's like whatever opportunity avails itself of you take. So a little bit it was like that. Berkeley was just such an amazing place to teach, and I also really I was living in Washington, D.C., teaching at GW, and I really wanted to come back to the West Coast because not LA, which I love LA from afar, but I didn't want to live there. And this opportunity presented itself, and it's definitely the best place I've ever taught. Like, I love the students, I love the campus, love the area, but the students are absolutely the best students I've ever taught.
Aww.
Yeah.
And how long have you been teaching here?
God, I think it's it could be 18 years.
Oh, wow.
I know, right? It's insane.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I have a 16, she's about to be 16, and she wasn't pregnant when I started teaching, so somewhere around 18 years, I think.
Wow. Do you have a favorite class that you taught?
I love 141. It's interesting because I think the go-to response, I would think, with a lot of professors would be the smaller workshops because you get to know students more intimately, and I do love those. I really love getting to know students that closely, but 141, it's massive and overwhelming and doesn't work in some ways because there's so many students, but it's also an opportunity for all these people who would normally not be able to take a creative writing class to take a creative writing class. It's the only class that there's 100 of us, and there's so few creative writing classes. So I love being able to kind of allow people to have that experience, and not just you have to apply and you have to already be good at this thing, or even you don't even have to want to be a writer to do 141. You could just want to have this experience. And so I love that class, and I just love hearing what people have to say, particularly about stories and poems, but particularly who maybe aren't English majors or aren't so immersed in something already that they don't have that kind of new novel way to look at things. So I do love 141.
Yeah, I've heard really great things about that class. And then, all right, my last question for you in this little section is, what were some of the challenges you faced in your career, and how were you able to overcome them?
Teaching-wise?
Anything wise.
I mean, publishing wise, that's a whole nother. I would say.
We're going to talk about publishing.
Okay, so I'll wait for that. For teaching wise, some of the challenges in my career, pandemic, probably.
Of course.
I mean, but ultimately, I would say, obviously the pandemic was horrible, but a couple good things came out of the pandemic for me. I mean, teaching online is just horrible, especially a creative writing class where you're not just lecturing at people. It's supposed to be like a discussion. But the good things that came out of that were, one, Zoom office hours, which I'm a big fan of, because you can have office hours anywhere at any time, and it's
big fan of those.
Yeah. And then the other one is that I had to do so much, like basically create PowerPoints for my class, which I'd never done before. I just used to write on the board, and I think it's a way better system. It's easier for me to teach because I have everything in front of me laid out, and it's also students can revisit the slides and stuff. So.
Right.
Yeah, I kind of spun that question for you.
No, that was great. All right, thank you so much. I'm going to let Alexander take over now.
Okay, so on to the next topic. This is going to be more about, your writing as a whole, book publishing. We'll start off with a very simple question. When did you publish your first book?
2008.
Wow, that was a long time ago.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then how long did it take you to write that one in particular?
Yeah, I mean, the novel, both novels took about the same time, which is about 5 years, which is both very normal and also kind of overwhelming. If anyone goes into thinking they're going to take 5 years to write a book, they never would. Everyone thinks they're going to take I'll get this book out in a year, which seems like a reasonable amount of time. Mm-hmm. But the truth is, it takes way longer than you think it does. But it's good to have those high expectations. Yeah.
Yeah, so where did you draw your influences from where you write your books?
Yeah. I had someone actually explain this back to me as a publicist, actually, which I thought it was such a great kind of encapsulation of what I tend to write about. So I've stolen it from her. And that was that I like to write about childhood trauma and the adults we become because of that. So both the novels kind of have that theme in it, but I also, sometimes I'm not exactly sure where ideas come from. I'm a big fan of this Lori Moore quote, which says something like, writers draw from their cupboard, but what you put on the table is not a direct replica of what's in your cupboard, right? So you don't go and you don't take the flour in the bag and set it on the table next to the carrots in the refrigerator. You got to make something of it. But you're still drawing from your cupboard. So that's kind of something I like to talk about when I talk about influences.
So I know that we mentioned in the beginning you've published about 3 books, I believe.
Yeah.
Your most recent one was The Joy of Cannabis. Yeah.
Yes.
What was it like writing a book in particularly about cannabis?
Yeah.
It feels kind of on theme, especially for the time.
Right. I mean, not in some ways, it was a massive direction change for me. I've considered myself a novelist and that's it. So this was kind of a fun pandemic project. And so it was totally different writing. I have done nonfiction before, and I've done kind of magazine writing, and so it was more in that vein, this kind of playful, fun kind of slant. But also there's a lot of research. I did a ton of research for this book, which was really, really interesting. So now I think that one of the best things about writing that book was that I get to kind of play doctor to a lot of people. I get people asked all the time, when I smoke cannabis, it makes me feel this and I don't like it. And I'll say, okay, well, let me give you some advice here. Or, let's try this or whatever. So that's kind of fun. And I will say that as we say in the book, and as I tell my children, cannabis is a wonderful plant, but it really does affect the frontal lobe until you're at 25 years old. So my advice is to not consume cannabis until you're 25. But we all know that is probably not going to happen for most people, so to consume responsibly. There's my I have to give my PSA.
In lieu of 420 being tomorrow at the time of this recording, please consume responsibly for any and all future 420s. Okay, so going back to what you mentioned earlier about your previous stories being the childhood trauma and how it turns into adults, how do you tend to approach these themes?
That's interesting. I mean, I'm not exactly sure, because a lot of the times I'll get the kernel of an idea and then begin writing on it, and then I would never be the novel takes over. It's, it sounds so ridiculous, but I tend to try and follow where it's going and what works for the story. And so a lot of times that's surprising. I there's this Yeats quote I love. It's actually not Yeats, it's an apocryphal Yeats quote, but it's attributed to Yeats. And he says, read what you like, write what you must. Mm-hmm. And I'm a big fan of that because I think the reading part of it, so often like students are told, and we're told even as writers, oh, you have to read these big important books. And although I think that's true, there's oftentimes like a reason that we're told to read the stuff like Harry Potter fanfic. Who knows why we're reading when we were trying to read that one? Maybe there's a reason. And the writing part is the same. Like, we don't necessarily know why we're drawn to write the things we're writing, but it's good to follow those obsessions. Like, the last book was about cults. Like, I wasn't in a cult. I don't know anyone in a cult. Like, who knows why that, like, spoke to me. But I just became kind of obsessed with, like, who joins a cult? Who creates a cult? Who are these people? What does it mean to be in a cult? So, yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I like the thought process. I like how you approach that. It seemed really interesting and intricate. I'm really interested in this book now.
Yeah.
Could we get a plug for that book?
The book?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a little bit of a hard one to encapsulate, but I usually, since we have time here, the backstory of the novel is that there's these two children that are raised in this kind of Eastern-leaning intentional community / cult, and they run away when they're teenagers and they go their separate ways, and the book starts in the present when they're adults. One of them has created his own intentional community, very different than where they grew up, and it's they are getting into a standoff with the government, and so he ends up getting in contact with this woman who he ran away with, who's now kind of a viral photojournalist. He asks her to cover what's happening on the inside so that they can get their story told. So she goes inside and then drama happens.
That sounds exciting. All right, so we're gonna move a little bit towards the publishing area because we're talking about your book. How would you say that your publishing might mirror a small publication similar to ours? Like, would you say the process was difficult? Would you say, like, as a professor and an author as well, like, is there like complications with that? Like, how does that all come together?
Yeah, I mean, publishing, there's so many kinds of publishing now. There's, Big Five publishing, there's like hybrid publishing, and then there's like self-publishing. So, and each of them has their own kind of way that they work. Traditional publishing or Big Five, but the traditional would incorporate like some indie presses too, which act like you would, like when you go to a bookstore, there's no way you'll know whether something was published by a quote unquote Big Five or an indie press, because they're all, on the bookshelves the same. But it is hard. It's really hard. And it's like a combination. I always talk about like the three things you need in order to become a successful writer are like one, talent. Like you can't like ignore that. Two is drive and determination and like discipline, I think, more than anything, like doing the work. And then the third is like luck. And the publishing piece of it, you have to obviously be talented and have done the work, but the big piece of it is luck. Like, why like an angel descends and decides to anoint this particular person is like, we don't know. And also success. Like, you have to written a good book, but also something that goes viral or, gets put in the right hands of somebody else. It's a lot of luck.
Yeah, I think similarly to our publication, I know Sofia was mentioning it earlier, we have different stories from all different types of, fiction genres, and there's some stories that really resonate with folks, and there's other stories that a lot of people have a disconnect with. So I definitely feel you on the luck aspect, because sometimes what works for some people doesn't work for others. And we would just like to preface that goes for any person. That does not mean that anyone's writing is particularly good or bad. It just means some people's writing is meant for some audiences and other audiences might not accept it. And that is totally okay. So thank you for that. On a final question, we talked about what it was like publishing. We talked about your authorship. What was it like to break into the publishing industry? How was that for you?
Hard, but also, okay, so here's what happens. Like, I usually in my small class, I talk about, we're going to do a mini publishing workshop, and I'll give you the nuts and bolts of how it works. But basically, your first thing you need to do is find an agent. And I had written my first novel, and I'd sent it to agents, got rejected, sent it to agents, got rejected. I think I'd gone through 3 rounds, and nobody was interested. And done revisions between each of those different rounds. And then the last round, everyone was interested, which was awesome. So I got to have probably the thing that every writer dreams of. And there's not that many times in the publishing process where you get to feel really good about yourself. There's basically 2 times. One is when agents are wooing you, and the other one is when editors are wooing you. So it was cool to finally, after like a year of submitting to agents and revising, have like 3 people that all kind of wanted the book and were going to tell me how awesome I was and how amazing the book was. Because like once you move past that stage, like no one's doing that anymore.
Okay, so lastly, we just wanted to talk a little bit about your current career and any advice you might have for our listeners. We're aiming for an undergraduate audience, so I think we have a lot of listeners who are looking to dive into the careers that you're involved in. First, I'm wondering, what advice would you give aspiring writers about publishing process and getting your name out there?
I would say, if we're talking about publishing, the most important thing is to write the best book that you can write. I mean, a lot of times students will ask me, do you have to be publishing short stories like Berkeley Fiction Review? And I'm always like, no, you should only be thinking about publishing short stories because if you want to publish short stories, it's not necessarily going to help your career. And the reason why is because, and I also say the other reason you should publish short fiction is because it'll make your parents proud. And they'll have something to show their friends.
Very true. Short fiction magazines are awesome.
Yeah. But the reason I say, like, don't worry about it career-wise is because the sad truth is that short fiction doesn't sell. Like, it's almost impossible to sell stories unless you've won some kind of prize. So when agents are interested in you, they will always say, oh, well, they read a short story of yours. That's great, but where's the novel? I always say the first thing you need to do is write the best novel that you can write, and that you want to have no problems with that before you send it to an agent. And the reason is because you get basically one chance. There was a day that agents would email you back, or even editors would say, or not email you, they'd actually talk to you on the phone, right, or mail you a letter and say, we love this, but this isn't working and this isn't working. Do you want to rewrite and try again? But that doesn't happen anymore. It's either a yes or a no, almost always. So writing the best book that you can write. And then when you're trying to find an agent, before even the agent, the publishing process in general, there's 2 things that I really recommend. One is there's this incredible blog by Jane Friedman. Google Jane Friedman writing. She was a publishing insider, and she's done such an incredible job of like breaking down how the industry works and how you need to kind of break in. Everything from writing a query letter to what do they want when they say they want their first chapter? What agents you should be looking for? Can you submit to more than one agent at the same time? And so there's all these questions that she does a fantastic job answering. And so oftentimes I'll answer them individually, but I like to direct students to her because she does an even better job than me, and then you have that all there. The other resource that's really great is something called the Writer's Market, and that is basically a listing of all literary magazines, small magazines, places to publish, and it will give you directions on what they want, how many new writers they take every year, like a lot of information. And so that's a great resource for like trying to like get your work out there.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for those resources. They're always helpful. Would you say that the process for both writing but also publishing is very different for short fiction? Or you talked a little bit about short fiction, but fiction and nonfiction, really?
Yeah. Fiction, nonfiction, absolutely. So everything I just said about, well, no, that's not true, because I just gave you resources. So but when I talk about like how fiction publishing works in a longer way, I always say this is nothing like what nonfiction works. I mean, the sad truth is that for fiction, you have to have the novel completely done in the best shape that it can be in before you show it to an agent. With nonfiction, it works totally differently. You sell a book based on the concept, so you don't have to write the whole book before you sell it. So they're basically pay you to write the book, which seems like, that's what we should be doing, but unfortunately that's not how it works with fiction. And also what they're looking for with nonfiction versus fiction is different. Obviously you also have to write a great book, but a lot of it is about platform now, unfortunately. But the good news is that for fiction, they'll love it if you have like 10,000 followers because you're just kind of cool. But it's not as important as it is for nonfiction, because nonfiction really is sold based on your audience and how much expertise you have in a field. And it's not like that with fiction, luckily.
Got it. Would you say you would give different advice to aspiring writers from a professor's point of view versus a published author's point of view?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, I think I give the same advice. I mean, I always say that you guys are so lucky that you get to be taught by like working writers, like so many writers in the department.
Totally.
And I think my biggest piece of advice, both professor and a writer, is like to read and write as much as possible. Read, obviously, and particularly contemporary fiction if you're writing contemporary fiction, because a lot of undergrads are reading like all this amazing literature, but it's, dated, like in good ways, but also in not good ways. And so a lot of you guys don't have understandably, like, the time to be reading a ton of stuff on your own. So I'm always like trying to push people to read contemporary fiction to see what's out there. And also just the more you write, the better. You know, you're training yourself to learn how to do this thing. You know, it's not like math where you learn theorems and then you're ready to take it on. It's a process.
Awesome. That's such beautiful advice. Thank you. The last thing I wanted to ask you was, are there any upcoming projects that our listeners can be on the lookout for?
Right, that's a good one. I just started working on a new novel, which is exciting. You know, I took this break to do the cannabis book, which was super fun, but I'm back in it. So all of you writers out there who are struggling with your own work, I feel you. I'm in the same boat, early stages of a book.
What are those stages like for you? How do you push through it?
Yeah, super exploratory. Like, I definitely taking like my own advice. Another piece of advice I give to young writers is small, achievable goals. E.L. Doctorow has this great quote I love, which is, writing a novel is like driving a car at night. You can only see as far as your headlights, but you can make it the whole way there that way. Mm-hmm. And he also says, and actually somebody else says, writing is a marathon, not a sprint. So it's like you have to take on these little bits at a time. And so I'm trying to kind of just see it in little chunks. And so my small achievable goal right now is really minuscule until the semester's over, which is like literally 15 minutes a day. That's like nothing. But it's more important to meet your goals than to have these lofty goals that you don't meet. So that's what I'm doing right now.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that advice. I'm sure our listeners will find it very helpful. Thank you so much for talking about publishing industry, your career with us. And thank you so much, Melanie, for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Berkeley Fiction Review is UC Berkeley's oldest undergraduate literary magazine. We look for innovative short fiction that plays with form and content, as well as traditionally constructed stories with fresh voices and original ideas. We invite submissions of previously unpublished short stories year-round and publish annually.